June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. At 0630 hours, the first wave of American assault troops prepared to storm the most heavily defended beach in Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Each soldier carried 60 pounds of equipment. Each man knew the statistics earlier reconnaissance suggested 30% casualties in the first wave, but their survival depended on a single piece of equipment that military planners had dismissed as impossible just 5 years earlier. A shallow draft landing craft capable of beaching itself, dropping a frontal ramp, and deploying 36 fully equipped combat troops in 8 seconds flat before retracting and returning for another load. The boat that made this possible was designated LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, but every man who rode one into combat called it the Higgins boat, named for the New Orleans boatbuilder who designed it against the explicit objections of the United States Navy's Bureau of Ships. Andrew Jackson Higgins created the craft that Dwight Eisenhower would later call the weapon that won the war for us in Europe, a claim that sounds like hyperbole until you examine the mathematics of amphibious assault and realize that without Higgins's design, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would have been impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins not in 1944 on the beaches of Normandy, but in 1938 in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, where Andrew Higgins operated a small boatyard building, shallow draft vessels for oil exploration companies, trappers, and lumber operations in coastal wetlands. Higgins Industries employed approximately 75 workers and generated modest revenues, building specialized craft for customers who needed boats capable of operating in water, too shallow for conventional vessels. The company's signature product was a tunnel-stern boat featuring a protected propeller recessed into a tunnel carved into the hull's underside, allowing operation in water as shallow as 18 inches without propeller damage from submerged obstacles. This design, developed through years of trial and error in Louisiana's coastal marshes, would become the foundation for the landing craft that changed amphibious warfare forever. Andrew Jackson Higgins himself was a man utterly unsuited to military bureaucracy and gloriously unconcerned with the opinions of credentialed naval architects who dismissed his designs as unseaworthy. Born in Columbus, Nebraska, in 1886, Higgins grew up in a family that valued practical results over theoretical elegance. He started his career in the lumber industry, learning firsthand about the transportation challenges of moving equipment and materials through swampy terrain where roads didn't exist and conventional boats couldn't operate. This practical experience, gained through solving real problems rather than studying abstract principles in university classrooms, gave Higgins an understanding of shallow water boat design that naval architects trained in conventional ship design simply didn't possess. By 1938, Higgins had been building boats for 20 years and had developed strong opinions about what worked and what didn't, based on direct observation of his designs operating under actual field conditions. He believed that shallow draft vessels needed protected propellers, sturdy construction capable of withstanding grounding and obstacles, and bow designs that allowed beaching without damage. These principles, derived from commercial necessity rather than military doctrine, would prove perfectly suited to amphibious assault requirements that the United States Navy hadn't yet fully articulated. The Navy, for its part, had spent the 1930s developing amphibious warfare doctrine through theoretical exercises and small-scale experiments, but had not yet solved the fundamental problem of how to get troops from transport ships offshore onto defended beaches quickly enough to survive. Concentrated defensive fire. The traditional method of amphibious landing involved troops climbing down cargo nets from transport ships into small boats that ferried them to shore, where they waded through surf under fire before reaching the beach. This method was slow, exhausting, left troops vulnerable during the approach, and deposited soldiers in chest-deep water where movement was difficult and equipment could be lost. Military planners recognized these problems but believed them inherent to amphibious operations, necessary evils that could be minimized through training and fire support but never truly solved. The Bureau of Ships, responsible for designing Navy vessels, approached landing craft design from conventional naval architecture principles, creating craft that looked like small ships because the designers knew how to design ships. These conventional landing craft featured pointed bows, deep drafts, and design characteristics optimized for seaworthiness during the approach rather than rapid deployment during the assault phase. The Japanese military, facing similar challenges in their expansion across the Pacific, had developed a landing craft featuring a bow ramp that dropped forward to allow troops to exit without jumping over the sides. The United States Marine Corps observed Japanese landing operations in China during the late 1930s and recognized the value of the bow ramp design. Marine Corps officers, more focused on the practical requirements of assault tactics than on the aesthetic principles of naval architecture, believed that a bow ramp landing craft would revolutionize amphibious assault by reducing deployment time and soldier exposure. However, the Bureau of Ships remained skeptical, arguing that a flat bow required for a ramp would make the craft unseaworthy, that the ramp mechanism would be unreliable under combat conditions, and that the entire concept was too radical a departure from proven naval design principles. Into this doctrinal disagreement stepped Andrew Higgins, who read about the Marine Corps' interest in bow ramp landing craft and immediately recognized that his tunnel-stern boats could be modified to meet their requirements. Higgins understood something that naval architects trained in conventional ship design that landing craft didn't need to be seaworthy in the traditional sense, because they only needed to survive the short trip from our transport ship to beach, not cross-ocean voyages. A landing craft could tolerate characteristics that would be unacceptable in a conventional vessel because its operating environment was fundamentally different. This insight, obvious in retrospect but revolutionary at the time, freed Higgins to optimize his design for an assault phase rather than the approach phase, creating craft that excelled at the mission-critical moment, even if they were uncomfortable during the journey to shore. Higgins submitted unsolicited design proposals to the Navy Bureau of Ships in 1938, arguing that his shallow draft boats could be modified with bow ramps to create superior landing craft. The Bureau rejected his proposals, citing concerns about structural integrity, seaworthiness, and Higgins's lack of formal credentials in naval architecture. The Bureau's skepticism reflected institutional bias, favoring credentialed experts over practical craftsmen, theoretical elegance over proven field performance, and conventional solutions over radical innovations. This bias was understandable. The Navy had succeeded for decades by following established design principles and accepting proposals from an obscure Louisiana boatbuilder with no formal training seemed like poor institutional practice. However, this same bias would nearly cost the Allies the capability to conduct large-scale amphibious operations at the precise moment in history when such operations became strategically necessary. The Marine Corps, frustrated by the Bureau of Ships' conservative approach, decided to conduct independent evaluations of landing craft designs. In 1938, Marine officers arranged for comparative testing of various landing craft proposals, including Bureau of Ships designs and Higgins's unconventional boats. The tests, conducted in realistic conditions rather than controlled naval architecture facilities, would demonstrate performance differences that paper specifications couldn't capture. Higgins brought his standard tunnel-stern boats to the trials, demonstrating their shallow draft capability, their ability to beach themselves bow first and retract under their own power, and their rugged construction that could withstand repeated groundings. Marine observers were impressed but noted that troops still had to climb over the sides, exposing them to fire and slowing deployment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Higgins responded by proposing to add a bow ramp to his tunnel-stern design, creating exactly the craft the Marines needed. He sketched the modification on paper during the trials, explaining how the ramp would be hinged at the bow and held in place by simple cable releases operated by the coxswain. When the boat beached, the coxswain would release the cables, the ramp would drop forward under its own weight, and troops could exit in a continuous flow rather than climbing over the sides. The mechanism was brutally simple, requiring no complex hydraulics or electrical systems that could fail under combat conditions. The ramp itself would be constructed from quarter-inch steel plate, light enough to be raised manually if the cable system failed, but strong enough to support troops running across it under fire. Marine officers immediately recognized the value of this design and pressed the Bureau of Ships to give Higgins a contract to build a prototype. The Bureau remained reluctant, but political pressure from Marine Corps advocates in Congress forced them to authorize a small contract in 1939 for Higgins to build experimental landing craft, incorporating his bow ramp design. Higgins returned to New Orleans and began modifying his tunnel-stern boats, adding the bow ramp mechanism and reinforcing the hull structure to handle the stress of repeated beachings. The prototype, completed in late 1939, was designated as an experimental landing craft and sent to Norfolk, Virginia, for Navy evaluation. The tests conducted in early 1940 would determine whether Higgins's radical design would be adopted or whether the Navy would continue developing conventional landing craft that looked like proper ships. The Norfolk trials revealed the fundamental superiority of Higgins's design in ways that surprised even its advocates. The Higgins boat approached the beach at full speed, approximately 9 knots, and drove itself firmly onto the sand with enough momentum that the hull remained stable rather than rolling in the surf. The coxswain pulled the ramp release cables, and the bow ramp dropped forward in less than 2 seconds. A squad of Marines charged down the ramp and deployed on the beach in 8 seconds flat, measured from the moment the ramp hit the sand until the last man cleared the boat. The coxswain then reversed the engine. The boat retracted itself from the beach without assistance, turned around, and headed back to the transport ship for another load. The entire beach to deployment to retraction cycle took less than 90 seconds. Bureau of Ships personnel, observing the trials, could not dispute the performance data. Conventional landing craft required troops to climb over the sides, a process that took 30 to 40 seconds and exposed soldiers to fire while they were most vulnerable. The Higgins boat reduced deployment time to 8 seconds, a 4-fold improvement that dramatically reduced casualty exposure during the critical transition from boat to beach. The shallow draft allowed the boat to beach closer to shore, reducing the distance troops had to wade under fire. The protected propeller meant the boat could retract without assistance from beach parties, allowing it to make more trips and transport more men than conventional craft that often required manual pushing to get them off the beach. Every measurable performance metric favored Higgins's design so dramatically that the Bureau of Ships had no technical justification for rejecting it. However, institutional resistance to radical innovation doesn't evaporate simply because test data validates the innovation. Bureau personnel raised concerns about production feasibility, arguing that Higgins Industries was too small to manufacture landing craft in the quantities that would be needed. They questioned whether the simple ramp mechanism would prove reliable after hundreds of deployments under combat conditions. They worried that the flat bow design would make the boats dangerous in rough seas, even though the boats only needed to survive short trips from transport ship to beach. These objections, while presented as technical concerns, reflected deeper institutional discomfort with accepting a design from an outsider who didn't follow conventional naval architecture practices and didn't respect the bureaucratic procedures that the Bureau used to maintain control over ship design. Andrew Higgins, for his part, responded to these objections with characteristic bluntness that offended Navy sensibilities while simultaneously demonstrating his understanding of what actually mattered. He pointed out that his boatyard had been building working vessels for 20 years, while Bureau designers had been drawing pictures of boats that often didn't perform as specified when actually constructed. He argued that production feasibility was his problem, not theirs, and that he could scale up production if given contracts and access to raw materials. He noted that the ramp mechanism's simplicity was a feature, not a bug, because simple mechanisms rarely fail while complex systems fail constantly. He dismissed concerns about rough sea performance by noting that landing craft would be operating in protected waters near shore, not crossing oceans, making blue water seaworthiness irrelevant to mission requirements. This confrontational style, while accurate in its technical arguments, did not endear Higgins to Navy bureaucrats who expected contractors to be deferential and respectful of the Bureau's authority. The cultural clash between Higgins's practical, results-oriented approach and the Navy's formal, procedure-oriented culture would persist throughout the war, creating friction that slowed production even as Higgins's boats proved indispensable to Allied operations. However, the events in Europe during 1940 would soon make these cultural disagreements irrelevant, by demonstrating that large-scale amphibious operations would be necessary and that only Higgins's design could make possible. Germany's conquest of France in June 1940 shocked American military planners and forced a fundamental reassessment of strategic requirements. With France defeated and Britain under siege, any future American intervention in Europe would require amphibious landings on a scale never before attempted. The United States Army began calculating how many troops would need to be landed in the first wave of an invasion of occupied Europe and realized that the numbers exceeded anything existing landing craft could support. Military planners calculated that a single infantry division, approximately 15,000 men, would require hundreds of landing craft to get assault troops ashore quickly enough to establish a beachhead before German defenders could concentrate overwhelming force against the landing site. The Marine Corps, vindicated in their advocacy for Higgins's design, pressed the Navy to place large orders for what was now designated the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. The Bureau of Ships, recognizing that wartime necessity overrode their institutional preferences, authorized initial production contracts in late 1940 for 50 boats, a number so small that it could barely support training operations, much less actual combat operations. Higgins responded by expanding his New Orleans boatyard, purchasing additional property along the Industrial Canal, hiring workers from Louisiana's shipbuilding and construction industries, and setting up production lines that could build boats in parallel rather than one at a time like traditional boatyards. The production techniques Higgins developed drew from automobile manufacturing principles rather than traditional shipbuilding methods. Instead of building each boat as a custom unit with craftsmen fitting components individually, Higgins created standardized jigs and fixtures that allowed semi-skilled workers to assemble identical components rapidly. Hulls were built from prefabricated sections welded together, rather than hand-fitted plates riveted to custom frameworks. Engines, transmissions, and other mechanical components were purchased from automotive suppliers who could deliver them in quantity rather than custom-built by marine engineers. The bow ramp mechanism, consisting of hinges, cables, and a steel plate, could be assembled by workers with basic welding skills following simple procedures rather than requiring master craftsmen. This manufacturing philosophy, treating boats as mass-produced industrial products rather than individually crafted vessels, offended traditional shipbuilders, but allowed production rates that conventional yards could never match. By early 1941, Higgins Industries was producing approximately 30 LCVPs per month, a rate that exceeded the combined output of all other landing craft manufacturers. The Navy, recognizing that Higgins's production capability was essential to amphibious warfare plans, authorized expanded contracts and provided priorities for steel allocation that allowed Higgins to increase production further. However, the Navy also insisted that Higgins license his design to other manufacturers to ensure adequate production capacity, a decision that Higgins resented because it allowed competitors to profit from his innovation without having invested in the years of development work that created the design. Nevertheless, Higgins agreed because he recognized that winning the war mattered more than protecting his commercial interests, though he would spend considerable effort during and after the war fighting to receive proper credit and compensation for his contributions. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed landing craft production from an important priority into an urgent crisis. American war plans now required simultaneous amphibious operations across the Pacific to recapture Japanese-held territory and eventual amphibious invasion of occupied Europe to defeat Germany. The scale of these operations would require thousands of landing craft, a number so large that it seemed impossible to achieve. Military planners calculated that invading Europe would require landing 5 divisions simultaneously on hostile shores, approximately 75,000 men in the assault waves, plus vehicles, artillery, and supplies. Each LCVP could carry 36 men, meaning that landing 75,000 men would require more than 2,000 boats making multiple trips, plus additional craft for vehicles and heavy equipment. The logistics of building, transporting, and operating this armada seemed overwhelming. Higgins responded to this challenge by expanding his operations beyond anything attempted in American industrial history. By mid-1942, Higgins Industries operated 7 plants in New Orleans, employing more than 20,000 workers. Production capacity reached more than 700 boats per month across all types, including LCVPs and larger landing craft for vehicles. The workforce included men and women, black and white workers integrated on the same production lines, a revolutionary practice in the segregated South that Higgins implemented because he needed workers and didn't care about social conventions. The plants operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, with boats rolling off production lines continuously. Raw materials arrived by rail and barge, were transformed into finished landing craft within days, and were shipped to ports for loading onto transport ships bound for combat theaters. The scale of this industrial mobilization matched anything achieved by major corporations like Ford or General Motors, accomplished by a company that had employed 75 people building small boats for swamp trappers just 4 years earlier. This expansion reflected Andrew Higgins's absolute confidence in his ability to deliver what he promised, a confidence that inspired workers, frustrated bureaucrats, and ultimately proved justified by results. Higgins personally walked the factory floors, talked to workers, solved production problems on the spot, and drove his managers relentlessly to meet deadlines. His management style was chaotic by corporate standards, but effective by the only standard that mattered. Boats were delivered on schedule and performed as specified when American troops needed them in combat. The technical specifications of the LCVP revealed design choices that prioritized mission requirements over aesthetic appeal or theoretical elegance. The hull measured 36 feet in length, 10 feet 6 inches in beam, and drew just 3 feet 2 inches of water when fully loaded with troops and equipment. This shallow draft, achieved through Higgins's tunnel stern design with the propeller recessed into a protective channel carved into the hull bottom, allowed the craft to approach within 50 feet of shore before grounding, dramatically reducing the distance troops had to wade under fire compared to conventional boats that grounded in deeper water hundreds of feet from the beach. The hull construction used 1/4-inch steel plate for the sides and 3/8-inch plate for the bottom, providing protection against small arms fire while keeping weight manageable for the 145 horsepower grey marine diesel engine that powered most production LCVPs. Earlier variants used gasoline engines, but diesel engines proved more reliable and eliminated the fire hazard that gasoline tanks created when punctured by enemy fire. The engine drove a bronze propeller through a simple reduction gear, providing a maximum speed of 12 knots when empty and approximately 9 knots when fully loaded with 36 troops plus crew. This speed, while modest compared to naval vessels, proved adequate for the short runs from transport ship to beach that constituted the LCVP's primary mission. The bow ramp, the feature that distinguished Higgins's design from all competitors, measured 10 feet wide and dropped forward to rest on the beach at an angle that allowed troops to charge down it without stumbling. The ramp weighed approximately 200 pounds, light enough that 2 crew members could raise it manually if the cable release system failed, but heavy enough that it dropped reliably under gravity when released. The ramp's leading edge was reinforced with a steel bar that absorbed impact when the ramp hit the beach, preventing damage to the thinner steel plate that formed the ramp's main surface. Simple cable guides welded to the hull sides prevented the cables from tangling, while the release mechanism consisted of basic hooks that the coxswain could operate with a single motion from his control position at the stern. This brutal simplicity reflected Higgins's understanding that complex mechanisms fail under combat conditions, that soldiers operating under fire don't have time for complicated procedures, and that maintainability matters as much as capability. Every component of the LCVP could be repaired by competent mechanics using standard tools, unlike sophisticated naval systems that required specialized technicians and custom equipment. Ramps that were damaged could be replaced in hours by welding crews working on beaches. Engines that failed could be swapped out and replaced with spares carried on support vessels. Propellers damaged by underwater obstacles could be changed by divers in minutes. This maintainability, rarely mentioned in historical accounts that focus on combat heroics, proved essential to sustaining operations over months of continuous use. The crew compartment, located at the stern behind protective armor plating, housed the coxswain who steered the craft and operated the engines, plus a crew member who managed the bow ramp and assisted with navigation. The troop compartment, occupying most of the hull's interior, provided standing room only for 36 fully equipped soldiers, arranged in 6 rows of 6 men each. There were no seats, because seats would have reduced capacity and slowed deployment. Troops stood holding onto rails welded to the hull sides during the approach to shore, enduring the pounding motion as the flat-bottomed hull slammed across waves, breathing exhaust fumes from the diesel engine, and watching the shore approach through gaps in the armoured sides, while preparing mentally for what awaited them on the beach. The experience of riding an LCVP into combat has been described by thousands of veterans in oral histories, memoirs, and interviews, creating a composite picture of an ordeal that tested courage before the actual fighting began. The boats were crowded, uncomfortable, and unstable, rolling and pitching in ways that made many men seasick during the approach. The noise from the engine, combined with the crash of waves against the steel hull, made conversation impossible. The smell of diesel exhaust, mixed with salt spray and the fierce sweat of nervous men, created an atmosphere that veterans remembered decades later with visceral clarity. Men urinated where they stood because there was nowhere else to go and no way to leave the packed compartment. Some vomited from seasickness or fear, the mess sloshing around the deck as the boat pitched. Officers tried to maintain discipline and focus, reminding men of their training, while sergeants cracked jokes to ease tension or cursed to maintain the illusion of toughness that men clung to as defense against terror. The final moments before the ramp dropped have been described as the longest seconds of many men's lives. The engine sound changed as the coxswain reduced speed approaching the beach. The hull scraped bottom with a grinding sound that signaled arrival. Then the mechanical clank of the ramp release cables, the crash as the steel ramp hit the sand, and the moment when the wall of steel that had provided at least psychological protection dropped away to reveal the beach, the obstacles, the defenders, and the incoming fire. Veterans described that moment as stepping from one world into another, from the uncomfortable but enclosed space of the boat into the vast exposed arena of the beach, where there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to go, except forward through whatever resistance awaited. The 8-second deployment time that had impressed observers during testing at Norfolk proved achievable in combat, but only because training drills had prepared troops to move with desperate speed. Sergeants positioned at the ramp's base shoved men forward if they hesitated, because hesitation created congestion that slowed everyone and increased casualties. The tactical doctrine emphasized continuous flow off the boat, no stopping, no bunching up, spreading out immediately once on the beach to avoid concentrating targets. Men trained to count to themselves as they ran down the ramp and across the sand, timing their movement to spread themselves at intervals, rather than clustering together. This training, drilled endlessly during preparation in England before D-Day, saved lives when men executed it under fire exactly as they had practiced countless times in safety. The coxswain, meanwhile, had his own desperate mission once the troops deployed. He had to retract the boat from the beach before the tide fell or before German artillery found the range, requiring precise control of the engine and rudder to back the boat off the sand without broaching sideways to the waves. If the boat stuck, the crew might have to abandon it and wade ashore, leaving the disabled craft to block the beach and interfere with subsequent waves. If the boat retracted successfully, the coxswain had to navigate back through whatever obstacles the Germans had emplaced offshore, including steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and mines, all designed to rip hulls or detonate when struck. Then came the return trip to the transport ship, loading another group of troops or supplies, and repeating the entire cycle again and again until the mission was complete or the boat was destroyed. The statistics of D-Day operations reveal the scale of what Higgins's design made possible. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, required landing 156,000 Allied troops within 24 hours across 5 beach sectors spanning 50 miles of French coastline. American forces landing at Omaha and Utah beaches used approximately 900 LCVPs in the initial assault waves, plus hundreds more for follow-on waves throughout the day. British and Canadian forces used similar numbers of LCVPs and equivalent British landing craft at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The total number of landing craft employed exceeded 5,000 vessels of all types, representing the largest amphibious operation in history, and a logistical achievement that would have been impossible without Higgins's mass production techniques. The first wave at Omaha Beach, hitting the shore at 0630 hours, faced the most intense resistance of any landing site. German defenders from the 352nd Infantry Division occupied fortified positions with interlocking fields of fire covering every approach to the beach. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces zeroed on the waterline waited for American troops to present themselves as targets. The initial wave of LCVPs delivered approximately 1,500 men directly into this defensive fire. Within minutes, the beach became a killing ground where wounded men sought shelter behind steel obstacles, dead bodies floated in the surf, and burning vehicles sent black smoke across the sand. The disaster that unfolded at Omaha Beach has been documented in countless histories, but what those histories sometimes obscure is that despite catastrophic casualties in the first waves, the LCVPs kept coming, kept delivering men and supplies, kept making trip after trip, even as German fire destroyed boats and killed crews. The statistics from Omaha Beach reveal both the horror and the necessity of the operation. First, wave casualties exceeded 50% in some units, with company commanders killed before reaching the seawall, platoons reduced to a handful of survivors, and entire boatloads wiped out by direct hits from artillery. Yet by midday, American forces had fought their way off the beach through sheer determination, numerical superiority enabled by continuous reinforcement, and the gradual suppression of German strongpoints by naval gunfire and bomber strikes. By evening, 34,000 troops had crossed Omaha Beach, along with vehicles, artillery, and supplies sufficient to establish a beachhead that German counterattacks could not eliminate. This achievement, purchased at terrible cost measured in thousands of casualties, demonstrated that properly supported amphibious assault could succeed against fortified defences when sufficient force could be delivered quickly enough to overwhelm resistance before defenders could concentrate reserves. The performance of Higgins' boats during the Normandy invasion validated every design choice Andrew Higgins had made. The shallow draft allowed boats to beach close to shore despite German obstacles placed in the surf zone. The protected propeller meant boats could retract without assistance, even after hitting underwater obstructions that would have disabled conventional craft. The bow ramp allowed troops to deploy in seconds rather than climbing over sides under fire. The simple mechanical systems proved reliable despite salt water, sand, and explosive shock from nearby shell impacts. The rugged construction allowed boats to survive groundings, collisions with obstacles, and even glancing hits from light weapons that would have sunk less sturdy craft. Most importantly, the boats could be produced in sufficient quantity to replace losses and sustain operations, meaning that destroyed boats could be replaced within days rather than weeks. The Pacific Theater operations revealed Higgins' boats performing under even more challenging conditions than European operations. Island assaults across the Pacific required landing troops on coral reefs, volcanic sand beaches, and jungle coastlines, where conventional landing craft would have been useless. The shallow draft and protected propeller design proved essential for navigating coral reefs that could rip open deeper-hulled boats or disable exposed propellers. The bow ramp allowed troops to deploy quickly and move inland through jungle terrain, where hesitation on exposed beaches would have been fatal. The mass production capability meant that even as boats were destroyed by Japanese fire, replaced by losses to coral reefs, or worn out by intensive use in tropical conditions, sufficient replacement craft remained available to sustain operations across thousands of miles of ocean. The Battle of Tarawa, in November 1943, demonstrated both the necessity and the limitations of amphibious assault. American Marines landed on Bayous Island using a combination of LCVPs and larger Amtraks, facing intense Japanese fire from fortified positions. The assault succeeded, but only after 3 days of brutal fighting and heavy casualties that shocked American commanders. The lessons learned at Tarawa informed planning for subsequent operations, leading to doctrine that emphasized overwhelming fire support, more extensive pre-assault bombardment, and improved coordination between landing craft, waves, and supporting arms. The LCVP performed exactly as designed throughout these operations, delivering troops under fire and retracting to bring more men forward, proving that Higgins's design worked under the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. The comparison between American amphibious capabilities, enabled by Higgins boats, and Axis amphibious capabilities reveals strategic advantages that shaped the war's outcome. Germany conducted successful amphibious operations during the invasion of Norway in 1940 and the capture of Crete in 1941, but these operations used conventional ships and landing techniques that would have been inadequate for opposed landings against prepared defences. Germany never developed purpose-built landing craft comparable to the LCVP because German strategic planning focused on land warfare in Europe rather than amphibious operations. When Germany needed to invade Britain after conquering France, the lack of specialized landing craft contributed to the cancellation of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion that never occurred because German planners recognized they couldn't get sufficient forces ashore quickly enough to establish a beachhead against British defenses. Japan developed specialized landing craft, including the Daihatsu-class landing craft that featured bow ramps similar to American designs, demonstrating that Japanese military planners understood the requirements for amphibious assault. However, Japan never achieved the production scale or logistical organization necessary to sustain large-scale amphibious operations against determined resistance. Japanese amphibious operations succeeded primarily against poorly prepared defenders in the early war years, but failed when opposed by American forces that combined superior firepower, air support, and continuous reinforcement enabled by mass-produced landing craft. The strategic mobility provided by thousands of LCVPs allowed American forces to bypass Japanese strongpoints, landing at unexpected locations, and forcing Japanese defenders to spread their forces across entire island chains rather than concentrating at predictable invasion sites. The Soviet Union conducted numerous amphibious operations during the war, primarily on rivers and lakes rather than oceanic coastlines, using improvised landing craft and conventional boats that lacked the specialized features of American designs. Soviet amphibious doctrine emphasized surprise and speed rather than the methodical build-up that American operations employed, reflecting both different tactical philosophies and the reality that Soviet forces lacked the specialized equipment and logistics support that American forces possessed. The United States provided some landing craft to Soviet forces through Lend-Lease, but the distances involved and Soviet strategic priorities meant that American amphibious techniques never became central to Soviet operations. The contrast between American and Soviet approaches revealed different solutions to similar problems, shaped by different industrial capabilities and strategic circumstances. Britain developed its own landing craft designs in parallel with American efforts, including the landing craft assault that served alongside American LCVPs in British operations. British designs emphasized seaworthiness and crew protection, reflecting British naval traditions, and the longer approach runs common in British operations. However, British production capacity could not match American output, meaning that British forces relied heavily on American-built landing craft throughout the war. The combined Anglo-American amphibious capability, pooling British expertise in combined operations with American production capacity, created the force that invaded North Africa in 1942, Sicily and Italy in 1943, and France in 1944. This partnership demonstrated how complementary strengths could be combined to achieve results neither nation could have accomplished independently. The production statistics for Higgins Industries reveal an industrial achievement that matched any other war production program. Between 1942 and 1945, Higgins Industries produced more than 20,000 landing craft of all types, including 12,500 LCVPs, Peak production reached 750 boats per month during mid-1944, requiring coordination of steel deliveries, engine shipments, component manufacturing, and assembly operations across multiple plants. The workforce reached its maximum size of over 30,000 employees during 1944, making Higgins Industries one of the largest employers in the South. The company's payroll pumped millions of dollars into the New Orleans economy, transforming the city into a major industrial center and providing employment opportunities that lifted thousands of families out of Depression-era poverty. Andrew Higgins's management of this industrial empire reflected his personality's contradictions. He was simultaneously a visionary who recognized opportunities others missed, and a difficult personality who alienated allies and created unnecessary conflicts. He fought constantly with Navy bureaucrats over contracts, payments, and design modifications, burning bridges that might have served him better after the war ended. He pushed his workers relentlessly, but also paid wages above industry averages and promoted based on performance rather than credentials or connections. He integrated his workforce at a time when such practices invited boycotts and violence in the segregated South, driven not by progressive ideals but by practical recognition that he needed workers regardless of their race. He accumulated wealth during the war years, but also reinvested profits into expanding production capacity rather than hoarding money, demonstrating commitment to the 7 times mission that transcended pure profit motive. The Navy's recognition of Higgins's contributions came grudgingly and incompletely during the war years, colored by the cultural clash between Higgins's brash style and Navy institutional preferences for working with established defense contractors who understood military procurement procedures. Higgins received contracts and payment for boats delivered, but the Navy resisted his demands for recognition as the primary innovator in landing craft design and fought his attempts to receive royalties from other manufacturers producing boats based on his patents. These disputes, petty in retrospect given the stakes involved, consumed time and energy that might have been better spent on production, yet they reflected genuine disagreements about intellectual property rights, the credit for innovation, and the proper relationship between military institutions and civilian contractors. Higgins believed his genius deserved recognition and reward. The Navy believed that contractors should serve national needs without demanding special treatment or excessive profit. Neither side was entirely wrong, and neither side was entirely right, leading to conflicts that persisted throughout the war and beyond. The human stories of men who built Higgins boats and men who rode them into combat reveal the personal dimensions of this industrial and military achievement. Workers at Higgins plants included women whose husbands and sons were overseas, using skills learned on the job to build boats that might save their loved ones' lives. Black workers found employment and fair treatment that Southern society otherwise denied them, building boats alongside white co-workers in integrated teams that demonstrated the possibility of racial cooperation even in the segregated South. Disabled workers who couldn't serve in combat contributed to victory by applying whatever capabilities they possessed to the production effort. Older workers beyond draft age found purpose and meaning in contributing to the war effort through their labor. The collective effort of thousands of individual workers, each performing specific tasks, combined to produce boats that changed history. The soldiers who rowed those boats into combat carried their own stories of courage, fear, determination, and sacrifice. Young men from every state, every background, every walk of life found themselves packed into steel boxes heading toward hostile shores, facing the possibility of death with whatever resources of courage and training they possessed. Some died before reaching the beach, killed by artillery fire that struck boats directly, or by drowning when boats were swamped by waves or sunk by obstacles. Some died on the ramps, shot down as they tried to exit, their bodies falling into water that turned red with blood. Some died on the beaches, unable to find shelter before machine gun fire found them. Some survived the landing only to die later in the campaign, during the long fighting that followed the initial assault. Some survived everything and came home, carrying memories of what they endured and what they witnessed, memories that shaped the rest of their lives in ways both visible and invisible. The mathematical relationship between industrial production and military victory, illustrated so clearly by the Higgins boat program, reveals fundamental truths about modern warfare that remain relevant decades after World War II ended. Superior weapons mean nothing if they can't be produced in sufficient quantity, maintained under field conditions, and replaced when destroyed or worn out. The most elegant design is worthless if it can't be manufactured by available workforce using accessible materials within required timelines. Theoretical perfection must yield to practical adequacy, when lives depend on equipment being available when and where needed. These principles, obvious in retrospect but frequently forgotten during peacetime planning, determined that Andrew Higgins's crude but effective landing craft defeated the Atlantic Wall, while more sophisticated designs remained on drawing boards or produced in quantities too small to matter. The aftermath of D-Day operations revealed the full extent of what Higgins' boats had accomplished and what their absence would have made impossible. Within 1 week of the initial landings, Allied forces had transported more than 326,000 troops, 50,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies across the invasion beaches. This logistical achievement, sustained under German artillery fire and against constant threat of counterattack, established the foundation for liberation of France and eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. The beaches that had been killing grounds on June 6th became supply depots by June 12th, with continuous streams of landing craft delivering reinforcements and material while evacuating wounded back to hospital ships offshore. The transformation from assault to consolidation demonstrated the flexibility and sustainability that Higgins's design provided, allowing craft optimized for the assault phase to transition seamlessly into logistics support once beachheads were secure. The comparison with historical amphibious operations before the LCVP's development reveals how revolutionary the Higgins boat actually was. Gallipoli in 1915, the Allies' disastrous attempt to land troops on Turkish-held beaches during World War I, demonstrated what happened when armies tried amphibious assault without specialized equipment or doctrine. British and French forces landed from conventional ships' boats, rowing ashore under fire, suffering catastrophic casualties during the approach, and on exposed beaches where they couldn't deploy quickly enough to overwhelm Turkish defenders. The operation failed completely, costing hundreds of thousands of casualties, and achieving nothing beyond demonstrating that amphibious assault against prepared defenses was impossible using conventional methods. The lessons from Gallipoli influenced military planning for decades, creating the widespread belief that modern weapons had made amphibious operations obsolete. The United States Marine Corps rejected this conclusion, arguing that amphibious assault remained necessary for any nation, with interests requiring power projection across oceans. During the 1920s and 1930s, marine planners developed theoretical doctrine for amphibious operations, identifying requirements that existing technology couldn't meet. They needed landing craft that could approach close to shore, deploy troops rapidly, and retract for additional loads. They needed fire support that could suppress defenders during the vulnerable approach phase. They needed logistics systems that could sustain operations beyond the initial assault. They needed training programs that prepared troops for the unique demands of amphibious combat. The doctrine existed on paper years before the technology existed to implement it, creating demand that Andrew Higgins's design ultimately satisfied. The institutional resistance within the Navy to Higgins's unconventional approach reflected deeper cultural conflicts about expertise, credentials, and authority. Naval officers trained at Annapolis and naval architects educated at prestigious universities believed they understood ship design better than a Louisiana boatbuilder with no formal credentials. This belief was reasonable in conventional contexts, where their training and experience did provide superior knowledge. However, landing craft design required solving problems that conventional naval architecture didn't address, because landing craft weren't ships in the traditional sense. They were specialized assault vehicles optimized for a single mission under unique conditions. Higgins understood this distinction instinctively through his years building boats for swamp operations, where conventional design principles didn't apply and practical performance mattered more than theoretical elegance. The Navy's credentialed experts, constrained by training that emphasized conventional solutions, struggled to recognize that landing craft required unconventional thinking. This pattern of credentialed experts resisting innovations from outsiders repeats throughout history, revealing persistent tensions between institutional knowledge and practical experience. Experts possess deep understanding within established frameworks, but often struggle when problems require thinking outside those frameworks. Practitioners without formal credentials lack theoretical sophistication, but often solve specific problems through trial and error that produces working solutions experts might dismiss as theoretically unsound. The ideal approach combines both perspectives, using theoretical understanding to guide development while remaining open to practical innovations that violate conventional wisdom. The Higgins boat program eventually achieved this synthesis, but only after years of conflict between Navy bureaucrats and a stubborn boat builder who knew his design worked regardless of what experts claimed. The broader strategic impact of landing craft availability extended beyond specific operations to shape Allied grand strategy for the entire war. The decision to invade North Africa in November 1942, rather than attempting immediate invasion of France, reflected realistic assessment of landing craft availability. American and British planners knew they didn't possess sufficient landing craft to invade France successfully in 1942, making North Africa the only feasible option for engaging German forces while building up the landing craft fleet. The North African campaign, often criticized by historians as a strategic diversion from the main effort of invading France, actually served the essential purpose of providing time for the landing craft production to reach levels necessary for cross-channel invasion, while simultaneously giving Allied forces combat experience in combined operations. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and Italy in September 1943 provided additional opportunities to test amphibious doctrine and equipment under combat conditions before committing to the Normandy invasion. These operations revealed problems with coordination between naval and ground forces, with fire support procedures, with beach organization, and with logistics that could be corrected before D-Day. The lessons learned were purchased with casualties, but prevented larger disasters during the Normandy invasion when stakes were infinitely higher. Every successful landing, and every failure that revealed problems needing correction, contributed to the accumulated knowledge that made D-Day possible. The Higgins boats performed consistently throughout these operations, validating design choices, and building confidence that the craft would work when everything depended on them. The Pacific Island hopping campaign demonstrated how landing craft availability enabled strategic flexibility that confounded Japanese defensive planning. Rather than attacking Japanese strongpoints directly, American forces could bypass heavily defended islands and land at weaker positions, forcing Japanese forces to spread their defenses across entire island chains. This strategy, impossible without thousands of landing craft capable of operating across vast ocean distances, has allowed American forces to advance across the Pacific while avoiding battles on terms favorable to Japanese defenders. The campaign from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, spanning thousands of miles and dozens of separate amphibious operations, demonstrated sustained amphibious capability that no previous military force had ever possessed. The Higgins boat, mass-produced in New Orleans and shipped to the Pacific by the thousands, made this strategy possible. The human cost of amphibious operations remained horrific despite technological advantages that landing craft provided. Omaha Beach casualties exceeded 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing on D-Day alone. Tarawa cost more than 1,000 Marine casualties in 76 hours. Iwo Jima produced 26,000 American casualties during 5 weeks of fighting. Okinawa cost 50,000 American casualties over 3 months. These numbers, stark and terrible, represent individual tragedies multiplied thousands of times. Young men who died far from home in service to causes larger than themselves. The landing craft that delivered them to hostile shores couldn't protect them from what awaited on the beaches, couldn't spare them from facing fire and steel, couldn't guarantee they would survive. The boats only provided the capability to reach the shore and the speed to minimize exposure during deployment. What happened after the ramps dropped depended on courage, training, leadership, and luck. The coxswains who piloted Higgins' boats deserve recognition alongside the combat troops they delivered. These sailors, often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on soldiers storming beaches, faced their own terrors during approaches to hostile shores. They stood exposed at the stern, steering toward beaches while enemy fire searched for them. They made split-second decisions about where to beach, when to drop the ramp, how to retract without broaching or sticking. They watched troops they had transported running into fire, knowing some wouldn't survive the next few minutes. They made trip after trip, suppressing fear and exhaustion, because their job was delivering men and bringing boats back for another load. Their contribution to victory was essential but invisible, the kind of unglamorous competence that sustains military operations but rarely receives recognition in victory celebrations or historical narratives. The post-war fate of Higgins Industries illustrated the cruel economics of defense contracting and the nation's ingratitude toward those who serve urgent wartime needs. When the war ended in August 1945, the government immediately cancelled landing craft contracts, leaving Higgins Industries with massive production capacity and no orders. Andrew Higgins attempted to convert his factories to peacetime production, building boats for commercial use and experimenting with various products. However, the skills and facilities optimized for mass-producing military craft didn't transfer easily to commercial markets. The company struggled financially throughout the late 1940s, burdened by debt accumulated during rapid wartime expansion. Higgins himself faced investigations by Congress over alleged excess profits during the war, accusations that ignored his genuine contributions and the risks he had taken when he expanded production capacity based on government promises of continued orders. By 1952, Higgins Industries had collapsed completely, with assets sold to pay creditors and facilities dismantled or converted to other uses. Andrew Higgins died in 1952, at age 66, having seen his life's work dissolve and his contributions largely forgotten by a nation that had moved on from wartime urgencies to peacetime concerns. The contrast between Higgins's crucial wartime role and his post-war obscurity reveals uncomfortable truths about how nations treat innovators once their innovations are no longer needed. The man whom Eisenhower credited with winning the war died, broke, and largely forgotten, while the boats he designed were being scrapped by the thousands as surplus equipment no longer worth maintaining. This ingratitude, while perhaps economically rational from the government's perspective, represents a moral failure that diminishes the nation's claim to honor those who served. The surviving Higgins boats today exist as museum pieces and monuments, preserved examples of a design that changed history but whose operational life ended when the war ended. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans, located in the city where Higgins built his empire, displays restored LCVPs and tells the story of their creation and use. Veterans who rowed Higgins boats into combat sometimes visit these displays, seeing again the steel boxes that carried them toward hostile shores decades earlier. The boats look smaller than memory suggests, more fragile than they seemed at the time, insufficient to the task they performed. Yet these modest craft, mass-produced by the thousands from simple materials using straightforward techniques, accomplished what elaborate designs failed to achieve. They made amphibious assault possible at scales that shaped the war's outcome and enabled strategies that defeated Axis powers. The technological legacy of the LCVP extends beyond World War II into subsequent conflicts, where amphibious and capability remained necessary. The Korean War required amphibious operations, including the Incheon landing in September 1950, where American and Allied forces used landing craft descended from Higgins's design to conduct one of the war's most successful operations. The Vietnam War saw continued use of landing craft for riverine operations and coastal insertions. More recent conflicts have employed modern landing craft that incorporate advanced materials and propulsion systems, but retain the basic concepts that Higgins pioneered: shallow draft, bow ramps, simple operation, rugged construction. The principle that Higgins established, that specialized craft optimized for amphibious assault outperform conventional vessels adapted to that role, remains fundamental to amphibious warfare doctrine. The broader lesson from Higgins's success concerns the relationship between innovation and institutions, between practical experience and formal credentials, between results and procedures. Institutions develop rules and procedures for good reasons, to ensure quality and prevent failures. However, those same rules and procedures can prevent recognition of innovations that violate conventional wisdom but solve problems in novel ways. The ideal institution remains open to outside ideas, while maintaining standards that prevent adoption of every unconventional proposal. The Navy eventually got this balance right with Higgins, adopting his design despite institutional resistance, but only after delays that could have been catastrophic if the war had begun earlier. The lesson for modern organizations is that expertise must be respected without becoming dogma, that credentials indicate knowledge but don't guarantee wisdom, and that practical results should ultimately determine which ideas merit adoption. The human dimension of the Higgins boat story reveals how individual determination can shape history when combined with historical necessity. Andrew Higgins didn't invent amphibious warfare or create the strategic need for landing craft. However, he recognized what was needed, designed a solution, fought institutional resistance to get his design adopted, and built the industrial capacity to produce boats in quantities that changed what was possible. His contribution was essential but not sufficient. The boats required crews to operate them, troops to ride them, commanders to employ them effectively, and industrial capacity beyond his own company to produce them in necessary quantities. Victory resulted from thousands of individual contributions combining into collective effort that overwhelmed Axis resistance through sustained application of force across multiple years and theaters. The mathematical relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness, illustrated throughout the Higgins boat program, reveals why democracies possess inherent advantages in sustained conflicts, despite often appearing weak during peacetime. Authoritarian systems can mobilize quickly for short wars, concentrating resources and suppressing dissent to achieve impressive initial results. However, democracies can sustain mobilization longer, tapping deeper reserves of industrial capacity and popular support that authoritarian systems can't match. The American ability to produce 12,500 LCVPs, while simultaneously producing 50,000 tanks, 300,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of other military equipment demonstrated industrial capacity that Germany and Japan couldn't approach. This capacity resulted from decades of industrial development, educational systems that produced skilled workers and engineers, and political systems that channeled popular energy toward shared purposes during crises. The sacrifice of the men who rowed Higgins boats into combat represents the ultimate cost of military victory, the human price that must be paid regardless of how good the equipment is or how sophisticated the planning becomes. Young men who should have had full lives ahead of them died on beaches whose names they barely knew, fighting for causes that many of them understood only imperfectly. They deserve remembrance not just for their sacrifice, but for what their sacrifice achieved: the defeat of tyranny, the liberation of occupied peoples, the preservation of free societies. The boats that carried them to shore were tools that made their sacrifice meaningful by giving them the chance to reach the enemy and fight, rather than dying helplessly at sea or drowning in deep water before reaching the beach. The 8 seconds from ramp drop to beach deployment represented the difference between massacre and battle, between helpless slaughter and genuine combat, where courage and training could influence outcomes. The final accounting of the Higgins boat's contribution to Allied victory acknowledges that no single weapon or piece of equipment wins wars, but that some contributions prove so fundamental that their absence would have made victory impossible. Without landing craft capable of delivering troops against defended beaches, the Allies could not have invaded Nazi-occupied Europe, could not have recaptured Pacific Islands, could not have brought force to bear where it was needed most. With those landing craft, produced in thousands by American industry and employed with increasing skill by Allied forces, amphibious operations became not just possible, but reliably successful. The transformation from Gallipoli's disaster to Normandy's success, accomplished in just 29 years, reflected the combination of doctrine development, specialized equipment, industrial capacity, and hard-won experience that Andrew Higgins's design made possible. The story of how engineers designed the Higgins boat to deploy 36 men in 8 seconds, faster than any landing craft before it, ultimately tells a larger story about innovation, determination, sacrifice, and the relationship between technology and human endeavor. It demonstrates that solving technical problems requires understanding the mission, not just the specifications. It shows that practical experience sometimes produces better solutions than theoretical sophistication. It reveals that mass production matters as much as individual perfection in sustained conflicts. It proves that institutions must balance respect for expertise with openness to unconventional innovations. Most importantly, it honors the memory of men who rowed those boats into combat, who faced terror with courage, who paid the price that preserved freedom for others. Their legacy, and the legacy of the boats that carried them, deserves remembrance as long as people value the freedoms those sacrifices secured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.